Today I thought it'd be fun to talk about how I got these search filters working without having to write a single line of JavaScript. So let's get to it. The easy way to make these filters work would have been to make each one a link. The problem with that would be that every time you click on a filter, the whole page would refresh. And not only that, but until the page finished loading, you wouldn't be able to keep interacting with the website, which isn't how people expect this kind of thing to work. The way they expect it to work is how user ingredients here in my other web app, EatHow, work, which is that when you click on something, only that area updates, and you can keep interacting with the rest of the page without a problem. The thing is, I had to write a lot of code to get that working. Luckily for me, there's a new-ish library called Stimulus Reflex that promises to make this exact kind of thing a lot easier. So I figured now's as good a time as any to give it a try. And what I should have done was gone straight to the documentation and read up on at least the basics of how this library works and how to get it installed properly. But what I actually did was look for a short video going over the bare minimum I needed to know in order to get this working. Except it didn't work. So then I figured that maybe the video was a bit outdated. So I went to the Stimulus Reflex documentation and I tried building out one of their examples to see if I could get it to work. But that didn't work either, so I figured I'd screwed up the installation somehow. And I was gonna check all of the files that Stimulus Reflex created and updated to see if I could find a mistake anywhere, but I couldn't do that because I'd mixed the Stimulus Reflex installation with a ton of other changes in my Git commit, and I couldn't tell which were the changes that Stimulus Reflex made. Which was lesson number one of this whole thing. From now on, whenever I install anything, I'll put it in a fresh Git commit and I'll test that everything's working before I save that commit. I also need to do a better job at keeping my commits smaller in general so that when something like this happens, it's a lot easier to narrow down where things broke. But anyway, back to South Florida project. Nothing was working still, so I went to the documentation and I found this troubleshooting page. And sure enough, the very first test they recommended that I run didn't work. Something was wrong with ActionCable, and at this point, I didn't really know what ActionCable was. So I had to stop being lazy and dig a little deeper to how this whole library works if I wanted to figure this out. Now, if you don't know what WebSockets are, I'll explain in a second. But if you do know what WebSockets are, here's everything you need to know about ActionCable. ActionCable seamlessly integrates WebSockets with the rest of your Rails application. Okay, so what are WebSockets, and what does that have to do with this library and with what I'm trying to do with the filters? Well, WebSockets are persistent connections between a client, in this case your browser where you're using South Florida Project, and the server. The way things usually work on the internet is through HTTP requests. When you visit a web page, your browser sends an HTTP request to the server where that web page is hosted, asking for the data it needs to build that page. Once the server gets that request, it can't respond through the same connection because HTTP automatically closes a connection once the message is sent. So when the server wants to send something back, it needs to create a whole new HTTP request. And going back to EatHow, that's how the ingredients here work. Every time you click on an ingredient to add it to your kitchen or add it to your shopping list, you're sending an HTTP request to EatHow servers saying, hey, add this data to the database and let me know when you're done. And while that's happening is when you see the loading spinner. And then once the server is done, it sends a new HTTP request back to the browser saying, hey, I finished that thing you told me to do, which is when the spinner disappears and the icon reappears. WebSockets, on the other hand, are connections that instead of closing after sending each message, they persist until the client or the server decides to close it, which should be faster than having to send a new request every time you want to do something. But what does that have to do with Stimulus Reflex and the search filters? Well, Stimulus Reflex uses WebSockets instead of HTTP requests to connect with the server. And ActionCable is the preferred way of using WebSockets in a Rails application. So that's what Stimulus Reflex uses. And that's why if my ActionCable isn't working, which it isn't, Stimulus Reflex won't work. Fortunately, the only reason my ActionCable wasn't working was because I was missing a line of code that's a part of the ActionCable configuration. Unfortunately, that took me too long to figure out. After I added that line of code and ran through the test again, everything seemed to be working fine. Then I tried the example in the Stimulus Reflex documentation, and that also seemed to be working fine. So it was time to try again with the filters. And now I'm going to show you the 3 lines of code that actually got all of this working. So the first thing I had to add was a data reflex attribute on each of my filter elements. And if you've seen my last video, you'll notice that this looks a lot like a Rails route, with the difference that instead of URLs, you use DOM events. In this case, when somebody clicks on one of the filters, Stimulus Reflex will go to the filter section of a file called search, which is right here. And I didn't have to name it search. I could have named it whatever I wanted, but I did have to include the underscore reflex. And I had to make sure that the file was inside of this reflexes folder, which Stimulus Reflex created on installation. Those are just things you have to do in order for the library to work. And remember how I told you that Stimulus Reflex uses WebSockets instead of HTTP? Well, declaring the data reflex attribute is what triggers that WebSocket connection. In fact, I can show you that right now. If I go back to South Florida project, I open Chrome Tools, oops, and I go to the Network tab. You'll see here one of these requests is a WebSocket connection. But if I go back to my code and I remove this line and I hit refresh, you can see there's no WebSocket at all. It never makes that connection without the data reflex attribute. Okay, on to the next attribute, which is data filter. And I could have chosen to call this whatever I wanted. I called it filter because that's what makes sense here. Inside of this attribute, I put the filter. And you'll see that the filter is declared twice. It's once inside the data attribute. Let's look here really quick. Once inside here, data filter development, and then the actual text that you see in the browser. And the reason for that is because I need that data later on in the search file. And Stimulus Reflex will automatically send it to the search file as long as I put it inside of a data attribute. It won't automatically send whatever value is inside of the HTML tag. So now let's take a look at the filter method inside of that search file. And all I'm doing here is I'm creating a variable that has the value that's inside this data filter attribute here, which I can do with element.datasetFilter. And I added an @ sign in front of that variable because Stimulus Reflex will automatically grab any variables that start with an @ sign and send it to the controller method for the page that we're in, which is the index method inside of the jobs controller. And as you can see here, I'm using that filter variable to grab all of the jobs that match that filter. At this point, Rails will take care of getting the data and send it back to the browser through that WebSocket connection. And instead of refreshing the page, Stimulus Reflex will check the new data, it'll check what's in the browser, and it'll update the browser only where the data changed. In this case, the list of jobs. And through that whole thing, I didn't have to write any scripts or touch a JavaScript file. Pretty awesome. So anyway, that's how Stimulus Reflex works. So that's been it for today. If you're still here, please do me a solid and click the like and subscribe below. It's the best way to support this channel and help me keep making videos like this for you.